Mr. Fabius, Miss Lund, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today at the Finnish Climate Summit. I am Veera Heinonen, and I will be moderating the plenary session today. The President of the Republic will be joining us shortly. Upon his arrival, I would like you to kindly stand up. Before we start, just a few practical questions. And obviously, one of the most important these days is the official hashtag of the event. And would you kindly please use Climate Summit when communicating on Twitter and elsewhere? But we will be soon starting when the President arrives. Also, a warm welcome and thank you very much for joining us today, President of the Republic. I would now ask Mikko Kosonen, the President of the Finnish Innovation Fund, to give his welcoming remarks. Please.
President Niinistö, distinguished international guests, Mr. Laurent Fabius and Ms. Skagen, Lund, Your Excellencies, Ministers, Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Finnish Climate Summit. On behalf of the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, together with the Finnish Climate Change Panel and the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, thank you for joining us today. This is not just another climate event. This is a platform for ambition, action, and acceleration. Firstly, ambition. We know we need to raise the level of ambition in our climate commitment to bridge the emission gap and to meet the common commitments under the historic Paris Agreement. Secondly, action. We all need to take firm action now in our different roles and capacities as leaders, experts, and influencers. And thirdly, acceleration. We need to encourage, inspire, and enable each other to accelerate our pace of change and to do more to reduce emissions. Remember those three key words: ambition, action, and acceleration. We will keep coming back to them during the day. The topic of this plenary session is everyone together. In order to tackle the climate crisis, we need to involve everyone: governments, companies, investors, cities, municipalities, and citizens from all countries, sectors, and levels of society. And to be successful, we need to take determined action together. everyone together. That is how we need to face the climate crisis. And that is how we can move further and faster now. Our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that the President of the Republic has taken the time to join us today. President Niinistö is already committed, both in words and deeds, to action, ambition, action, and acceleration when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. One manifestation of this is the upcoming high-level Kultaranta talks this weekend, which will delve into the question of sustainable growth and climate. Please join me in welcoming the President of the Republic, Mr. Niinistö.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to join you here this beautiful morning. What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. This quote from the former US President Eisenhower is often used to describe pressures on decision-making in turbulent times. It is easy to lose sight of the really important things when new pressing issues compete for your attention every day. But now, most of us decision makers have fully understood that combating climate change is important. The problem is that we are still not sufficiently grasping the urgency of it. Yet climate change is one of those rare phenomena that are both important and urgent. There's no time to wait. Actions are needed now. Climate change is not only an environmental matter. It has also direct implications for questions of peace and security. I have sometimes spoken about three different kinds of peace that are fundamental to our well-being. Peace as the absence of war, peace within our societies, and peace with the environment. Climate change has an impact on all those three. If we fail to make peace with the environment, domestic and international conflicts are likely to follow. If we allow global warming to proceed, it will quickly turn into a hard security issue as well. Rising sea levels and extreme weather events can lead to wars over territory and resources. Migration will grow dramatically, and some areas become uninhabitable. Sooner or later, climate change will require major changes to our entire lifestyle. We will have to reconsider how we produce our energy, how we move from one place to another, and how we live, behave, and consume. Such an information will never be easy or cost-free. But delaying the inevitable will only make it more difficult and more expensive. The question is, do we want to make these changes only when they are forced to happen, when there is no longer any other alternative? Or are we willing to act in time and by doing so prevent some of the most worrying scenarios? In other contexts, I have often stressed the need to rediscover a sense of community. Understanding that we belong to the same community, despite all our differences, also helps us to take responsibility for it. Seeing the welfare of the entire community as a personal interest should turn us into more active members of it. Instead of passively waiting for others to contribute first, we can decide to take action ourselves. This most certainly applies to combating climate change. Finding solution is our common responsibility. Every single one of us is needed. As individuals, as companies, as cities, as states, but above all, as a community, whether local or national, regional or global. The key concepts chosen for this event are ambition, action and acceleration. Three important headlines, all being starting with the letter A. For the former finance ministers, the AAA also brings something else to mind. The highest rating to the most trustworthy economies. And trust, of course, is an essential ingredient of any community worth its name. As a global community, despite all our differences, we have for decades been able to trust the rules-based international order. Old agreements have been kept, although new ones have been increasingly difficult to arrive at. In this regard, December 2015 was a remarkable milestone. Under the skillful chairmanship of Laurent Fabius, he is with us here today, the Paris Agreement brought great news for the environment and great news for the international order too. Paris returned our trust in international negotiations and agreements. Now, 2.5 years later, the picture is unfortunately a lot more somber. The voluntary contributions from the state parties are nowhere near to keeping the global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. One of the largest emitters has announced its intention to withdraw from the agreement altogether. And beyond climate politics, the trust in the entire rules-based international order is sinking rapidly. The obstacles are real, but giving up is not an option. The importance and the urgency of the climate challenge are not about to disappear. On top of fulfilling our existing commitments, all of us need to do even more. Every step in the right direction helps. And I believe that concrete steps, even small ones, are much more valuable than grand gestures. As the current chair of the Arctic Council, Finland is pushing to reduce the emissions on black carbon in the Arctic area. Black carbon is a global problem. Unlike the long-term impacts of CO2, black carbon has immediate effects. In the Arctic, it accelerates the melting of the sea ice. This creates a negative feed-up loop, making climate change even faster. But the positive side to the story is that our action can also have an immediate impact. If we are able to cut down black carbon emissions, for instance from maritime transport, from old-fashioned power plants and from flaring in oil and gas fields, we will make a significant contribution to combating climate change in the Arctic. And saving the Arctic is essential in saving the globe. Focusing on this goal, Finland is advocating a first ever Arctic summit, bringing together the heads of state and government from the 8 members of the Council, the United States, Russia, Canada, and all the 5 Nordics. A fine high-level commitment to reduce black carbon emissions in the Arctic would be welcome news for the environment. And it would also benefit the other key themes I have touched upon here: peace, a sense of community, and trust. Success is not guaranteed, but the potential rewards are high. For the sake of our common future, we must not leave a single stone unturned. Ladies and gentlemen, in this spirit, I wish you all a successful meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your sobering words, Mr. President. The President pointed out, if we allow global warming to proceed at this rate, it will quickly and certainly turn into a security issue. I think this is very important to keep in mind. Now next, it gives me tremendous pleasure to invite a very special international guest to deliver his keynote speech. Laurent Fabius is the president of the French Constitutional Council, a very distinguished position in its own right. However, already prior to his current position, he has unrivaled experience from international, European, and French policy. Previously, Mr. Fabius served as the President of the National Assembly, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. In 1986, he was elected as the youngest ever Prime Minister in modern France. Many of you will remember him as the President of the historic UN Climate Conference in Paris 2015. We feel privileged and honored to have you with us today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Fabius. Hello, sir.
Mr. President of the Republic, Mr. President of CITRA, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased and honored to be here in your beautiful country and to be here particularly with your president, who personally is really committed to environment, both at Finland level, European level, and worldwide level. And I pay tribute to his continuous action. The high-level program of this Finnish Climate Summit underlines the dynamism of the Republic of Finland regarding climate change, as well as the very major role played by economic actors in that field. And not in Finland, but more generally, the positive role played by economic actors is a new factor and one of the most positive ones. As former president of COP21, I've been asked to give my views on the ways we can and must move further and faster in tackling the climate crisis. I will try to answer by going through 2 points. First, I will broadly present the present situation in terms of climate action. Then I will say a few words about an initiative that is now being discussed by the UN, the name of which is the Global Pact for the Environment. First, let me draw briefly, very briefly, a broad picture of climate action at a worldwide level. And I will speak bluntly, because it's necessary. The situation in that most important domain is worrisome. The adoption of the Paris Agreement in December 2015 was in itself a very successful step and, to some extent, a turning point. 195 countries decided to adopt the first universal climate pact in history. We achieved a robust agreement, universal, ambitious, fair, and as legally binding as it was politically possible. As you know, it includes, and this result was far from settled in advance, the objective of holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, above pre-industrial levels, and of pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to only 1.5 degrees. It includes as well the aim of carbon neutrality by the second half of the century, and furthermore, a mechanism for a 5-yearly review of commitments is planned, with the obligation of always going upwards in the ambition and never backwards. The Paris Agreement, which was ratified in 2016 with an unprecedented rapidity, has been a leap forward that pushed most countries to take concrete action, both public and private, for tackling climate change. And this is obviously very positive. And Finland, on this matter, leads by example, and I can only encourage you to go ahead on the same path. However, and this is what I call sometimes the post-Paris paradox, despite the success of the Paris Agreement and the worldwide efforts, the overall present situation is critical. The year 2017 was the warmest on record without an El Niño event, and one of the 3 warmest years. The average global temperature has been steadily rising, and if we follow the current trend, our 2 degrees increase could be passed before 2050, that is to say 50 years before the intended target. In short, the deterioration is worse and faster than what was imagined. Second, the current state of the world's energy mix is worrisome. In terms of technology, innovation, and financing, renewable energy resources are much more easily accessible and much cheaper than before. And that is obviously very important. But they do remain unequally scattered throughout various regions of the world and quantitatively insufficient. About 80% of the entire global energy mix still relies on the burning of fossil fuels, 80%. Third, the world has suffered a major setback when the American president announced his intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Not only does it exclude the second biggest polluter from the agreement, but it also gives a very bad example to other countries that might have some doubts whether to keep really engaged or not, in spite of the remarkable reaction in the US themselves of many cities, regions, universities, and companies. What do I mean? I mean that we have achieved in Paris a universal signature, but it is not a secret to say that some countries which have signed were not so enthusiastic. And today, because of the decision of the American president, we show that in the fact. Fourth, there are some decisive question marks regarding the attitude of various countries. And I would quote some elements which will be decisive. The launch or not of new coal-fired power plants, particularly in South Asian countries, and the decision of oil-producing countries to keep exploiting fossil fuels or to shift to cleaner energies will be critical decisions. The same applies for agricultural methods, and you know that some new methods can be very efficient in terms of saving our environment. The evolution of the energy mix, especially the level of investment in renewable energies, will be undoubtedly a crucial issue for the years to come. Last but not least, the goal and achievement of Europe and the issue and the progress made on the issue of carbon pricing will be equally decisive. Another major difficulty lies in the implementation of the Paris Agreement itself. The agreement was a strong and new framework of principles and commitments, but it needs a work program for concrete implementation. The so-called Paris Agreement work program, which is now discussed, should be formally approved at the COP24 in Poland next December. At present, discussions on this issue are rather difficult, especially as public financing is concerned. In that perspective, important decisions have to be made on key issues like adaptation and mitigation, transparency, monitoring, and financing. In that regard, economic actors and innovation play a crucial role. In short, the coming period of 2018 to 2020 represents a very decisive 3 years. And the role of Finland will be decisive because you are presiding over the Arctic Council and you will preside Europe next year. Next October 2018, the IPCC report on the conditions for staying below the 1.5 threshold and also the San Francisco Global Climate Action Summit organized by the Governor of California, Jerry Brown, will take place. Important points. Then, in December, we shall have the COP24 in Poland. Next year, in 2019, we shall have many events, among them the UN Climate Summit organized by the Secretary General of UN, and COP25 will take place. And in 2020, among many other events, we shall have the upwards revision of national contributions, the effective availability of funding and technologies, the full implementation of the Paris Agreement, and the important Convention on Biological Diversity in China, and hopefully the adoption, I will come back on this in a few minutes, the Global Pact for the Environment. These are some of the steps that will be taken, hopefully, in the next 3 years. We are in a race against time. Different disciplines and events are all interconnected. There is not a moment to lose, and it is the reason why I think the motto, ambition, action and acceleration is an excellent summary of what is to be done. Because, and this is a point I want to underline, climate change is not a sectorial problem which will take place only in a distant future and in some particular domains. It is a completely cross-cutting issue and an urgent issue. Climate disruption has some obvious and rapid consequences on biodiversity, development, health, food, security, migrations, and ultimately on peace and security. All these issues are interrelated. Thus, tackling climate change should not be a standalone policy, but a systemic one. Since all issues are connected, we need both specific and large solutions, global and local actions, bolder actions from all the concerned parties, states, but also non-state actors, local authorities, banks, NGOs, businesses, and the ordinary citizen. Ladies and gentlemen, I have used the word systemic, interrelated phenomenon that requires going further in our fight against climate disruption, a goal I know here we all share. This leads me to my second and quicker point. A global response is precisely the aim of the project I mentioned, the Global Pact for the Environment. Until now, the fundamental principle of environmental law have only been enshrined in declarations with, in reality, few or no legal value. In 2015, the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement created a new atmosphere and a momentum which allows further action. And my belief is that we now need a genuine international treaty gathering these principles in a realistic approach. In 2016, when I became president of the Constitutional Court in France, I was invited to support and chair the project of a global pact for the environment. A first draft was elaborated by leading legal experts throughout the world. The project was presented in Paris in June 2017, then endorsed by the French president, Mr. Macron, and officially launched during the UN General Assembly last September. And since then, the diplomatic phase has been successfully underway. What could be the content of this global pact? The draft proposes to establish some fundamental rights, for instance, the right to live in a healthy environment, sovereignty over natural resources, common but differentiated responsibility, and so on and so forth, as well as duties with regard to nature, the duty to take care of the environment, the polluter pays principle, etc., etc. Many of these principles are widely known, some rather new, like the so-called non-regression principle. The pact, and I would like to underline this point, is a sort of umbrella text compatible, fully compatible with the numerous and existing sectorial international agreements. Regarding the current discussion at the UN, just 1 month ago, the General Assembly voted a first resolution establishing a working group to discuss the Global Pact project and asking the UN Secretary General to deliver a report on the matter by the end of this year, 2018. This resolution has met a wide approval, and particularly Finland. The aim is now to open formal diplomatic negotiation next year in order, hopefully, to adopt this treaty, preferably by 2020. This pact will contribute, among other things, to a betterment of environment protection and create a space where the same environmental norms will be applied to all, making it easier for companies to undertake necessary formalities and to ensure that they carry out their social and environmental responsibility, and it will provide so greater legal security. You understand from my summary that it will not be easy because it's both ambitious and realistic, but my belief is that it could help. And if we think about the international situation, in 1966 were adopted two pacts by UN, one of the economic and social elements, and one on the political and civil rights. And time has come now, more than 50 years after, to take the same resolution in this new field, and so important for today and tomorrow of environment. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Paris Agreement was never intended as the end of the road. Its aim was and is to be the start of new, intense and collective efforts to tackle climate change and the general deterioration of our environment. Not only we cannot slow down, but on the contrary, we need to speed up the pace. We do need to move further and faster in our response to climate disruption, and we need to involve all parties in this endeavor. It is why this conference and our common efforts are so important. The environmental threat is planetary, therefore the response must be planetary too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Fabius. You reminded us that we as an international community are entering a critical period in 2018 and 2020 when we should really push things forward, including Finland as the chair of the Arctic Council. We will take note of that. Mr. Fabius, also, you gave us hope that there are powerful forces working for proper regulatory framework for the environment in the form of the Global Pact for the Environment, so we'll be cheering for that. Our second international guest today is Skagen Lund, who serves as the Director General of the Confederation of Norwegian Enterprises. Prior to joining the Confederation, she held positions at various Nordic and international companies, including the Norwegian telecom company Telenor, newspaper Aftenposten, and Unilever. She is also a member of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. Thank you very much for joining us today, Skagen Lund.
Well, Mr. President, Mr. Fabius, and distinguished guests, I'm very honored to be invited to come and speak to you about the role of business in combating climate change. So thank you so much. And I often find myself saying that the real litmus test for climate policy is whether they generate and accelerate business action. Because without business action, no climate ambition can be realized. We have to make these things go together. And business action is actually pretty straightforward. It depends on the market, customers' preferences and willingness to pay. It depends on technology, and it depends on regulatory framework. These three factors are key to bringing about business action, sustainable development, and the low-emission society. So that is what I will be talking to you about. Now, for Norwegian business, sustainable development and environmental issues have been on the agenda for decades already. And what started as necessary add-on cleanup actions about 40 years ago have now turned into key strategic issues for the company's future development. And the same trend is seen worldwide, of course, here in Finland, in Norway, in Europe, in China, Asia. So this green race is really on, and we see great momentum building for it. And as we aim for the low-emission society in 2050, we examine opportunities in the circular economy with resource efficiency, more use of renewables, both for raw materials and energy, recycling, reuse, more decentralized solutions to save transportation, and more cooperation. And this calls for a new mindset. Just like Mr. Fabius alluded to, we need to examine systems rather than the single parts. We have to view cities, energy, food and land use, industry and water as economic systems, and we need to understand their boundaries. We must acknowledge the unique role of industry and energy in the transition process, and we have to look at the value chains from raw materials to finished products, from use and reuse, and we have to understand that we need many and different policy instruments along these value chains. And what we need basically is a business case for greening the industry, where we combine economic value and job creation with reduced emissions. Maybe to put it a bit more simply, we need to make this profitable. We need to make it good business, and then at least I'm convinced it will actually work. And I have examples of how we can achieve it if business and governments join their forces, and I'll try to sum it up in 3 points. So my point number 1 is that we need ambitious but realistic targets. We now have a very ambitious Paris Agreement, and let me pay tribute to you, Mr. Fabius, and to France for orchestrating the Paris process. The future calls for stronger and stronger national commitments. But we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of actually doing what is already agreed. And for far too long, the Norwegian climate debate has been a political competition in who could set the most ambitious target. Politicians and NGOs, they seem less concerned about the implementation of these targets and what's already been agreed. And this created a distance between ambition and action for business and for the general public alike. And we have to make sure we avoid ending up in that same dead end after Paris. My point number 2 is that targets must be accompanied by appropriate and effective policy instruments. The first best solution would be a global price on carbon, and I stress global. And since that is out of reach, especially these days by even the most optimistic calculations, unfortunately, we turn to the second best option, regional and national efforts. And there are positive signs. And as a member of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, I want to underline that in addition to pricing of carbon emissions, the new climate economy points to greater climate disclosure and greening of finance as very important drivers for future sustainable investments. Moreover, both Finland and Norway will be part of the EU policy program with common efforts for the ETS sector and with national burden sharing targets for the non-ETS sectors. And of course, there are challenges, not least national challenges. One example is Norway's ambition of a 50% reduction in emissions from transportation by 2030. That's only 12 years away. Finland's ambition is at the same level, and Sweden's is even higher. Most of the discussions have been about just that, the ambitions, and less on the instruments to achieve them in a competitive way for value creation, to make good business of it. And that even when it is a fact that the Nordics have a competitive advantage here in advanced biofuels, given the right framework and policy instruments. But the instruments, they exist. One such instrument is technology development incentives, which have helped bring about several success stories in Norway. We have the Karmøy technology pilot. It's a full-scale pilot of testing the world's most climate and energy efficient aluminum production technology. It's a huge project, huge plant. The floating wind turbine Hywind, which is combining existing offshore expertise that we have with wind technology. A new vessel is being built now. It's called Yara Birkeland, and it will be the world's first fully electric and autonomous container ship with zero emission. Huge ship, huge container ship, no people, no emissions. And a full-scale value chain for carbon capture and storage is currently being developed, including a cement plant and a municipal waste handling facility, and the underground storage facility that is being developed in the North Sea will be available for customers from other countries and industries. And I have to add that this is a very expensive project, very important though, and I indeed hope we will succeed with it. Another effective instrument is public procurement. In Norway, we do not have a large domestic market to give new solutions that first big push onto the market, and neither do you here in Finland. And that is why using public procurement as an instrument for innovation could be a very important win-win. The public sector would get greener, better goods, services, and solutions, and the private sector would have more security, create more value, and create more jobs. One example is that the world's first electric car and passenger ferry, Ampere, was developed and built in Norway a few years ago. It was set in operation in 2015 after being commissioned by the Norwegian Public Roads Administration. So combining public procurement and innovation incentives is a very strong driving force for those type of developments. And now several new electric ferry projects are on the way, as well as a pilot on hydrogen. And by 2020, about 50 ferries will have batteries and be classified for zero emission. So that's great. And we then have created a new export industry as well. So it does pay off eventually, although there is that initial cost. But we are doing good business on electrical ferry. So I've come to my third point. My first was about the realistic targets and focus on implementation. The second was the policy instruments. And now I come to the third, which is that we must make better use of public-private partnerships for innovation and market stimulation. And in Norway, we have successfully developed a combination of voluntary agreements and public funds for implementations of new solutions, and I'll explain what I mean by that. We have an example. It's the Norwegian Ngos fund. It shows that we can both deliver solutions to an environmental problem and implement new technology and create a competitive advantage. That's a triple win right there. And it works like this. NOx emissions from the maritime sectors emitted by ships basically are taxed, and then the proceeds from that tax are subsequently redistributed back to the ship owners for investing in cleaner technology, installing clean equipment, for example, upgrading ships' engines, or switching from diesel to LNG and electricity. And going forward, we now have a new proposal that we're working on. We have suggested a similar fund for the CO2 emissions from commercial transportation. So specifically, we propose that the CO2 tax on businesses' fuel usage, which today amounts to about 210 million euros per year, is channeled to a fund rather than to the Treasury. The Treasury does not like this, I have to say, but we'll see. Business can then apply to that fund to cover the additional cost of climate-friendly transportation equipment. And in return, business will have to legally commit to emission reductions, and there are penalties if we then don't meet those targets. Hence, we believe that such a fund could be a very precise instrument and supply just the right amount and balance between the carrot and the stick, and then contribute positively to our carbon commitments, as well as giving a boost to our competitiveness in the transportation sector. All nations have their specific challenges, opportunities, and potential for contribution to the transition process towards the low-emission society. Here in the Nordic region, we have vast natural resources and a unique position with our energy systems and energy-related industry having already low carbon intensity. This is a great advantage. And going forward, the circular economy and bioeconomy will have an increasing role. Like forests, the oceans are important in combating climate change, and Norway has a special position there and a strong commitment to the global ocean agenda and the ocean-based industries, petroleum, fisheries, and the aquaculture business. Our Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, has been instrumental in the recent setup of an international high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy. And in Finland, I expect you have an equally important role and a strong position when it comes to the forest and the forest industry. So one of the recommendations from the Nordic Council of Ministers Ollila report in 2017 was more Nordic energy cooperation. And in March this year, the Council's Sundtoft report on green transition follows that same path, calling for more Nordic cooperation. The Nordic region can provide climate services to Europe in the form of renewables and balancing power, as well as carbon neutral products from forests and fisheries. And towards a low carbon society, the circular and bioeconomy must expect it to really have a steadily increasing role, and our solutions can help speed up that transition and at the same time give us competitiveness. Hence, I expect we really have one thing in common, a need for unprecedented public-private partnership to develop and implement new green solutions and to meet the urgency of our challenges with belief and confidence in our solutions and ability to do it. Both Finland and Norway have a lot to offer in terms of technology and competence, not only to Europe, but to the global community. And as Mr. Fabius said, this is a planetary issue. So if we are to change the world, I think we have to also start paying a lot more attention to the virtue of upscaling. Because upscaling addresses the fact that global problems call for global solutions. And upscaling pays dividend for the climate as well as for the economy. Upscaling means taking our successes and making them bigger. We have to start thinking big. And if we succeed in doing that, we will also have created a situation where business not only feels responsible for solving society's problem, but where solving society problems actually has become our business. Thank you so much, and good luck with our common effort.
Thank you, Kristin Skogen-Lund, for providing us a very crucial business perspective on climate action. Your speech was an important reminder of the need for businesses and governments to join forces to accelerate the introduction of climate solutions. You also rightly pointed out that we already have some of the instruments on hand, like public procurement, that we should really use more effectively. And thank you for also reminding us about Nordic cooperation, as we can do a lot more together. Next, ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that the President of the Republic and our distinguished keynote speakers will be departing before the panel. So please join me in thanking again the President and the speakers. Thank you. And please, can I introduce my colleague next, who will be joining me in moderating the panel, Oras Tynkkynen. Welcome.
Thank you, Vera. I'm very happy to join this important discussion today, and I have the pleasure of inviting 4 great leaders and experts to join us on the stage for this exciting panel. First, we have Outi Honkatukia, who is the Chief Climate Negotiator for Finland and has a background in the Ministry of Finance and the OECD. Please, Outi Honkatukia, if you can join us. We also have Mia-Petra Kumpula-Natri, who we all know as a member of the European Parliament, but who also happened to be a member of Parliament here in Finland, right across the street. Please do join us here on the seats if you can. We have Jorma Ollila, who was already mentioned by Kristin Skogen Lund earlier for many of his services, including the work for the Nordic Council of Ministers, but we know him also as the chair of board and the former CEO of Nokia and the chair of the board of Shell, please. And we will be joined by Minister Berner. Welcome. Very excellent timing if you can come forward to the stage and take your seat. Please, the seating is free. You can choose the one that makes you the happiest.
We will be also sitting down, so yes,
Pyydettiin
we'll
lavalla.
have you in this. And then Minister Berner, perhaps next to Jorma Ollila.
Welcome. We want to focus the discussion today on the 3 key words that President Mikko Kosonen already mentioned today and that have been referred to many times after that. That is ambition, action and acceleration. How can we raise the ambition in our climate commitments? How can all of us take more action? And how can we as well inspire and enable each other to go further and faster to achieve more together? So let me start with Outi Honkatukia. You represented Finland in the International Talanoa Dialogue under the UN Climate Convention, which has been discussing the past, present and future of international climate action. How do you think we can get countries to raise the ambition of their national commitments, and what could be the role for Finland and the EU? And perhaps if you can also say a few words about what the Talanoa Dialogue actually is.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope the microphone is working at least. Feels a bit funny, but that's because I have a funny-shaped head. Okay, so thank you first of all to Sitra for getting this great crowd together, and very pleased to be here and actually tell you a few words about the International Talanoa Dialogue that's now happening in the UNFCCC context. Talanoa, it's a Fijian word for building consensus. So it's pretty much sort of sitting around in a circle, sort of sharing stories, discussing best practices. We're now doing this in Finland, also in the Ministry of Environment. Minister Tiilikainen is organizing these roundtable discussions. Nothing as big as grand as this one, so this is really a very key event here. So there was a Talanoa event in the Bonn climate negotiations now in May, and I represented Finland there, and it was really sort of, sharing best practices, sharing stories, discussing on what is exactly the climate action happening at home, how can we do more, and learning from each other. So it was a very different setting from the traditional, sort of the normal UN negotiations where you kind of almost like, just sort of, it's like theatre, you have 1,000 people in the same room, you're just sort of, reading sort of written statements, and that was really, so the Talanoa was really more about listening and learning rather than having prepared statements. So your question on what the, how to raise ambition and what the EU and Finland can do, I think it's pretty much sort of, sharing the success stories and best practices, sort of telling what we are doing already. I mean, we have a very good reputation. The EU has a very good reputation. When we say that we will do something, when we say that we will reduce emissions, we actually implement the policies. So it's not just sort of making pledges, but it's really sort of implementing and through climate action. So if there's one thing on Talanoa, I would just say it's implementation. Doing the climate action on the ground.
Thank you. If we turn to Mia-Petra Kumpula next. the Finnish government is advocating raising emissions targets for the EU 2030 period. Just like your group, political group in the European Parliament, how do you think we can make this happen?
First of all, I think there is today the trilogues that should then complete the energy efficiency package. So this is the first answer that Europe should really reach the goals it has set to itself, and it means the clean energy package, renewable energy, energy efficiency, the buildings efficiency, charging points for the electrical vehicles, a lot of other documents on the traffic, good fuel quality, the car type approvals. There is a lot to do at the moment. So if we do these, then I go to the businesses and I go to all the actors to say that, sorry, it's not enough. The new round is going to happen very soon, as we heard today. If we remind us also the Paris, it said that there will be a review and it will be very soon, and we know that action will not finish here. So all the time, if you have a knowledge or technology that you can do better, do not do the minimum that directive says. That's my number point one. So that is why we also think that it's possible to accelerate and speed up. And I think that then we can help with the next big files that are coming also in the European level. It's the biggest fund in the whole world for the research and innovations, Horizon Europe. So I think that in that one we can always guide the research also to pave the way for the transition that is needed. But then my point, what I really want to raise up something new, is not debated in Finland, not enough. It's not passing through in Europe, not enough yet, but it's there, it's coming. It is the just transition. And I think and I hope that in Finland the government could take it on board, or also we can see maybe with the help of Sitra to have the national analysis and deeper analysis, because if you also that it should be inclusive and have everyone on board, businesses but also people. So I state that it's not the privilege of the rich only to be energy efficient or to be climate friendly. So then we need to make this transition, and often it sounds like, okay, we have to pay the poor country. Yes, sometimes it's true, but it's also on the national level, it's among us. So I would like to see that sustainable development goals, which are global, it's sustainable development, and we know that to be sustainable we need the climate and earth to live in, and then take this just transition inside there. Sometimes we have proposed, my group in the European Parliament, Social Democrats, that there should be funds, for example, for emissions when we go to the trade, or then when it's that we know some sector is influencing. So we don't want to see the workers unemployed, we want the new skills, and this sector, which is making cars, to develop something that is needed. The skills are needed, mobility is needed, new companies is needed. So I want to also stop by saying that just transition is not to stop transition, it's to push transition for the right way so that it is inclusive, and I hope it will help in the international negotiations as well, when people and countries can see this fairness.
Perhaps just transition can actually enable ambition, because it can give you the security that whatever happens in the transition, you are not left behind, even if you happen to be working in a high carbon industry today.
Thank you, Mia-Petra, for that, and we'll certainly take note of the question, and we have indeed, and I think that needs to be more focused on just transition. If I turn to Anne Berner next, and as minister, you have advocated some large reforms, and sometimes even meeting fierce opposition. So really the question is, how can political leaders introduce big reforms that sometimes are not very popular even, in order for us to meet the targets aforementioned?
We are living in many ways in a very special time. We have an extremely fast technology development. Digitalization is creating a change in our behavior in an unprecedented way. And climate change and the actions that we need to take for climate change to mitigate it is actually something which is very much based on values. And when we are leading the change and need the leadership to change how we behave, how we make choices that are still based on common values, we need as a government to find the way to include, exactly as Mia-Petra said here, to include everyone to make it possible to be a part of that change. Some of that change we have to enforce by creating legislation, which is not always popular. But we have always also noted that even strict regulation will enforce an even faster technology development and will create, again, new dynamic solutions and behaviors. And I think the important thing is not to understand if and when and how popular our decisions are, but how can we make them to sustain time? And how can we make sure that one decision creates a logical path for a next decision, even if the ideological composition of the society or its government will be different in the next phase. And climate change is something that needs to be sustained over time in its decision making. And this is also why we have to set paths where we are creating decisions that base one on the other in such a way that everyone can, in the end, understand the value of it and be a part of it. And I think the circular economy is an extremely good example. Most of us are today somehow a part of recycling something, even if in our daily life. We also are a base of behaving completely different than the generations before us. And so this is something where our strength in climate change is still that we share a common value. And on this we have to build.
Just perhaps a quick follow-up. This is not the easiest thing to communicate to voters when we're speaking of systemic change. What would you say now with your experience from the reforms? What have you learned?
I have learned mostly, and what we are doing constantly in our ministry is having dialogues. Communicate. Today we had this morning 2 hours of discussion on how we are creating the next best possible environment for aviation. How will we see that aviation will be a part of travel chains, but also a part of our mitigation of climate change? How will we induce an environment that will be sustainable also from a point of view of aviation? And when we look at the discussion, we always have all the parties included so that we can create a best possible dialogue. And in the end, we still have to have the one voice that say, now we do it like this and we go that way. But then at least the process has been a possible one and an inclusive one. And this, I think, is we need to learn in public office to do more inclusive decision making instead of feeling that it is something that is exclusive to some of us.
Thank you. Highlighting dialogue really ties in nicely with the concept of the Talanoa dialogue that is happening internationally. Yeah. And incidentally, Minister Berner has also participated in that at the national level. Now, transitioning from the old to the new is not easy for businesses either. As for example, if your business is working on fossil fuels and you would need to transition to low carbon energy sources. What in your experience, Jorma Ollila, can facilitate this transition in businesses, and how could possibly governments and perhaps the EU help in this regard?
Yeah, thank you. I liked a lot Kirsten Skogen-Lund's presentation because she really got into the point, which is that if businesses are really gonna act upon the goals and the principles and the values that we all adhere to and feel are necessary, they will need to feel that this is good business, that there's profit around the corner if you do the right thing. And if we now look at the experience of the last 20 years or so, what business most and foremost does want and need is a price for carbon, because it is the prices in the marketplace that settle the markets, make sure that the supply and demand meet. Prices and opportunities for profit, they are the incentive to investment. And the problem has been that we have not had a price signal that if you produce something which has a lot of carbon, that this would be penalized somehow or is somehow not good for profit long term and even really bad for the globe. So the price for carbon is really the only way to go ahead. Yeah. Then I see people already thinking here that, well, haven't we had the cap and trade, the ETS in Europe? There's a Californian system. There are some other state systems in US. There's a system in China. The fact is that there have been much too low ambitious level in their implementation. So even $40 or 40 euros per ton is not enough. We need higher price, and the other way, so the other way, one way obviously is to make sure that the cap and trade is implemented a lot better in a way that leads into true international recognition of the issue. The fact that there has not been very good implementation on cap and trade has led into quite a lot of discussion on carbon tax. Any economist would tell you that in theory these are two same things if you implement them in the right way. But carbon tax, particularly in the US, has gotten a lot of support. There's actually an initiative which has gotten some real core Republicans. You will be surprised, yes. Some core Republicans, sort of Howard Bakers and Henry Kissinger's, and a lot of younger people as well. So the idea being that yes, carbon tax is difficult to implement because essentially a politician who imposes a new tax will not be re-elected. But if you create a use for the funds which is popular, there's talk of tax reduction for the middle class, as you can imagine from the current political climate. That's one. So carbon tax is possible if you really are imaginative, and it has to be well implemented. Really, as a summary to answer to your question, I don't think we can be very happy on how business has been able to respond because we haven't had the price signals for the business to operate on. Business people are not very good at reacting to international declarations, even if there are 129 or 139 countries saying that this would be a good thing. Business people react to real opportunities in the marketplace, and the carbon tax or cap and trade, which I personally favor more than the tax, would be the way, it seems the only way to go ahead here.
I think Jorma Ollila gave a very powerful message now to our regulators. Who would like to comment first? Mia-Petra.
Yes, it's known that the ETS is also giving too low price signals. Then we created new functions to try to help and then try to increase the price and then to take a side if we succeed and go and develop. So the tool is there, it just doesn't function the way it should. And then what I think that also I liked very much the Norwegian speech here, as all the others, they gave a good picture of the whole situation. I think that on the combination of the public and private, it is to do on the innovations and then on the new sectors to also do that. But also the consumers, what they are ready to pay for. So it is the price signals, can you do the win? So whoever wants to produce something that you can get something much better from the markets, and then the price signal is there. When I think about the big campaigns or big talks about the plastics, I start already without price signal to think how much I do want to have that crap in my home. With the children family, we all recognize there is too much stuff. So we're very happy to get rid of some of stuff in Facebook groups that I don't know the others in the Brussels before coming back. So then kind of circular ideas are there. So I think that it is manifold, this whole picture, that yes, this is clear message from the businesses and the carbon price. We have talked also in the parliament a lot on the possibility on the carbon tax around EU borders. Then we have analyzed it. Is it possible in the WTO rules or not? You can avoid it if you want to have the healthy issues. And is it unhealthy to really pollute? And then it could be said that, yes, that could be the way to proceed. But I know, for example, the country I know best, as we say, is not very enthusiastic to take steps on that one, like Finland also, that then you are in the trade war, which is not very much hoped on these days. So at the same time, I think that is one more tool to mention here. We do have the trade agreements. And in TTIP, even not many, some didn't like it. I always see that as a possibility to always have some rules on the environment issues, as for the workers, as for the consumers, but also take the climate on board in the trade issues. It's possible.
Carbon pricing is such a central tool in the fight against the climate crisis that it's probably worth getting all of your views here. Outi Honkatukia, you have a background in the Ministry of Finance and also in the OECD, so you understand this issue very well. Jorma Ollila was saying that we need a carbon price above $40 per ton, and we are nowhere near that, even in looking at the futures on the ETS market. So how do you think we could get there?
I mean, I think reform of the ETS is a start. It probably doesn't go. I mean, the European emission trading system, it doesn't go far enough as one would hope. I think if you're just looking at the ETS price development right now, it is going up. It's going up slowly, but it's finally going up. I think now with the more and more of these sort of regional emission trading schemes being implemented, including in China and so on. I mean, we are going to get the level playing field, but it is going to take time, and I think that's perhaps from the business perspective is the problem, because you want to have the assurance now that the carbon price is going to go up in order to take those investment decisions. I mean, I do think what the public sector can do is to set the target and take care of the enabling environment and make sure that the long-term perspective is there. So I think one way that we can obviously operate is that we have a very clear target for 2050. I mean, the Paris Agreement is a very good guide. You know, we're aiming to keep the global temperature below 2 degrees, aiming towards taking our efforts to get towards 1.5 degrees. I think that then sort of, working backwards from there, you can sort of say that what kind of emission reductions you need to make now in order to achieve the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, including the one on carbon neutrality by the second half of the century. So the long-term perspective is there. It's just the challenge of kind of making sure that it gives the right incentives to the businesses right now. Maybe just a very quick comment on carbon tax. I mean, I believe Finland was the first country in the world to implement a carbon tax, which we then had to abolish when we joined the European Union. Yeah, exactly. So just to,
There we go.
so we're not sort of, we're not sort of getting into new territory here. At the same time, also, I mean, we have carbon taxes of a sort. I mean, we have very heavy taxes on transport fuels, for example, where we have a tax based on the energy content and the carbon content. So there's a lot there, but it would, of course, I mean, be helpful if we. I think it would be a good start if we let the EU ETS to actually guide rather than sort of having all these derogations and coming up with ways to avoid the steering effect of the emission trading scheme as it is.
Yeah, just very brief comment to the effect that when I've been looking at what's happening in the US, while we tend to look at the CNN headlines from the president and some opposition comment, a lot is happening every day in the key states. More than half of the states in the US are looking at carbon tax or cap and trade system. How do you bring consumption of coal down? And very aggressive, imaginative new forms. When you follow the US, Europe actually looks pretty quiet. I hear it's the reality is that both in Brussels as well as in countries, not much is done. Then you have a majority of the states doing this and that, and they don't care about what Mr. Trump is saying. They just move ahead. Also, businesses move ahead, and let's not. Somehow, I've been trying to say that the Nordic countries should be very aggressive and take some Nordic measures and pilots, experimenting more, and all the Nordic energy ministers whom I've tried to talk about that have the same answer. We really don't want to rock the boat in European Union. We want to take a European view. But I mean, if that means a 10-year delay in getting things done, it's not a very good answer. But it comes from energy ministers today. Really loud, and I don't think that's a good answer. So if Brussels is not moving ahead, I think Nordic countries should take even more action, even if we are miles ahead of rest of Europe in CO2 intensity and all of that.
At this point, I think it's a good time to get a comment from Minister Berner for both the carbon trade issue, but also is the EU an hindrance of some sort when moving ahead? That's what Mr. Ollila is implying. And also Mia-Petra, will let you comment.
Yeah. I think in the whole setting of both the Paris Agreement and also our target setting, we also need to understand that we are not easily achieving those targets without much stronger measures. And we have right now some measures in place which are functioning and going in the right direction, like in the ETS system. But we only have to look at the sector of transport, which carries a large proportion of the emissions that we are creating. And we can very easily see that with the current decision making, we will not achieve our target for 2030, let alone come to a target of a carbon neutral transport by 2045. So we have to find more aggressive measures. And this is again based on very different parts of solutions. And we can't rely on singular decisions. We have the taxation measure, but we also have the measure of regulating more efficiency into the system. And a lot will still eventually, especially when we look at transport, be based on the behavior of people and the change that digitalization can bring into the system, which will be one of the most efficient tools that we will have to mitigate climate change. And when we look at some of the questions, are we able to create an emissions trade system into transport? It will be complicated, but the question is, can it be done? And I fully agree with Jorma Ollila, maybe a little bit in this case against our energy ministers, that the Nordic countries need to move ahead as a joint force in this field. And if the Nordic countries do work together, we can set steps for Europe in a certain way where we can set very different actions. Also, especially looking at the Arctic areas where we have interests, but also when we are looking at the Nordic areas as a total. So again, as governments, we have more possibilities. And what Mia-Petra mentioned about the trade agreements certainly will probably much more need to take into account also our future on how we do react to our need to mitigate climate change. The question is, how do we handle different sectors which are completely global? And how do we make sure that in that case we come to agreements. In that respect, I still think it's important that we have a large base of countries that agree so that we can create a global solution for new markets, and in a certain way also enforce technology developments that will support our emissions control by imposing innovation requirements to the industries.
Mia Petra, you had a remark.
Yeah, just a short remark. I think that Finland and Sweden and Norway and Denmark, all the possible who wants to go ahead, there never should be like limitation from the European side. But I must say honestly that also I happen to hear every now and then what is the uptake on the countries who are doing what in the trialogues, and it's not always that the Nordic countries are leading the negotiations. Maybe because we want to do it a different way, but then at the same time, if we want to have the global targets, and just the name today, energy efficiency, there is still a majority of the parliament who wants the binding targets for the countries. And many say that it's because it's so clear signal for the businesses that this is the way my country will do. I know that it's not a Finnish opinion, it's not of the many people I know here from the industries, it's too binding. But if we still see the future that it will be needing these actions, why not to concretize on that way? So there is 7 countries, 8 countries, and Parliament and Commission didn't propose it now. So it's all the time the shifting goal. And then I liked very much when Tiilikainen also sent a letter that we want to act more with the several member countries. But I wish to hear more often also the Finnish, that Finland is supporting the Parliament view, that not to water down something. And this is always good to do. Anne mentioned so many times the digitalization, and I think that is one key answer. And this is something that maybe there is a much more knowledge, but I still think that Finnish knowledge is here, and then that is also needed so much in the global and European discussions as well, that how the digitalization will be then the way to pave to the non-emission Europe. Way we live, way we consume, way we move, and whatever. Why did I fly here from Strasbourg? Why I wasn't on the screen only and avoid these emissions? So it will be so much fun, and it was so much opportunities. So in the end, if climate change is something that you have fears, it's a different attitude. If it's fun, it's hopefully fun for everyone, new businesses, startups, and people to think new way.
Perhaps it's a good time to point out that at Citra's events, we always offset our carbon emissions. So any emissions that come from organizing this type of events will be offset using various measures. I think Christine Skogen mentioned one key concept, which was first best as opposed to second best, and that ties into the discussion here. Global carbon price, first best option, we don't have that. We are not going to get that anytime soon. So should we use the second best, suboptimal, not ideal, not perfect solutions, such as energy efficiency targets at the EU level? But also Mr. Fabius made the point about Finland's important role both as the chair of the Arctic Council and the future president of the EU. So I wonder if that is an opportunity you see for Finland as a small country to influence what happens at the EU and even international level. Minister Berner, of course, the government has been preparing for the EU presidency. Can you perhaps talk a bit about that?
Absolutely, and I think that the possibility that Finland has had now as a presidency of the Arctic Council has enabled us to bring on the table much more also issues that are related to climate mitigation and to emissions control, especially in the marine sector and in the areas where we are having the possibility to strongly commit ourselves to be against the use to go towards more LNG fleets and so on in the Arctic areas. And this is also something which our president has been very much advocating. Within our EU presidency, it is extremely important that we do move forward, and that we have now a possibility to take responsibility, especially in those areas where we feel strongly, of which transport would be one. but there are also others. And so this is, of course, a possibility for Finland to put a mark on this discussion. At the same time, I still would like also to say that our active part in our Nordic cooperation should bring this opportunity also together at the same time.
I would still like a follow-up on the EU presidency question. I mean, it certainly would be a time right after the Arctic Council presidency to move things forward in a very ambitious way. So has the government made plans to prioritize, for instance, circular economy or questions such as the emissions targets?
Yes.
During its presidency.
Yes, circular economy will be prioritized during our presidency. Also, of course, like I mentioned, the more ambitious targets on emissions reduction in transport are one of our priorities, as well as also to see how can we create our bioeconomy in such a way that it will support. And fourthly, I constantly remind that I still think that digitalization will be one of the most important tools in climate mitigation, so that we have a very strong focus in our presidency on digital actions to support climate mitigation as well as also to create new ways and possibilities, not only between business and governments, but also on an individual citizens level to participate in the decision making that is a part of our everyday action. The plastics discussion will be brought forward again also in our presidency.
Outi, would you like to comment as well?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly on the EU presidency, which will then be the second half of the 2019. I mean, it will be an interesting junction because obviously Finland will be speaking on behalf of the EU at the UN summits on climate and so on. At the same time, it's going to be just timing-wise, it's a bit challenging times because obviously we will have a new government at the time and there'll be a new commission. So there's it's a bit of a sort of a transition period, but at the same time, obviously, you know, Finland will be taking the lead.
Okay, Mia-Petra and Anne then.
Yes, just to continue on that, I think it's very crucial, or the most crucial is maybe also to send a signal that there is not going to be a change on our aim to really act on the climate change. Because when it was the last election 4 years ago, European Parliament first, and then around November you have commissioners after hearings in the Parliament. Many people in Finland also thought that now Europe is in so deep in a crisis with the Greek package 1, Greek package 2. I'm boring to remind you of these years. So that maybe climate challenge is not that ambition in a European Union, and they were wrong. Even if the economical crisis was very acute 4 years ago, climate target has remained, and I'm very wishing, and this is my message also for the Finnish government then, to really have this firm international speak out that this is the way to continue. It will be also the year that we will finalize the MFF, the 7-year budget. If not before, there is a still good try, which I'm a bit skeptical that we can do it in 3 months in my committee, for example. 16 files on the innovations and research. I will do the Connecting European Facilities and Euratom and 43 billion and so it will take time. So then Finland also is there. And then at the very final level in the trilogues, I am pretty sure that Parliament wants to push again that it is sustainably the monies are used. And then also there, I don't know the exact position of the government yet, but I think that it is time on to also show the future, the climate-friendly, low-emission way, how we finance the common European facilities, the energy infrastructure, road transportation infrastructure, and digital infrastructure. So this goes all in all together. Or then we just choose that any investment is better than no investment.
Minister Berner had a follow-up.
Yes, just a very short comment on the fact that even if the Finnish presidency comes at a very special junction where Finland will have a new government, but also the parliament will be new in Europe and commission will be in place only at the end of the Finnish presidency, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Finland to participate and write as much as possible into the Commission's next plan. And I think this should be our main target, that we really take the opportunity to influence the next Commission's program and to make sure that our views are very well integrated. And this, I think, will be the most important of our missions and also our possibilities.
This is something of a big takeaway from this panel, is that we certainly have an opportunity to make a big impact EU-wide.
I think one key point that Mr. Fabius raised earlier, not surprisingly, was echoed by Kristin Skogenlund later, was the role of all these non-state actors. We have been talking a lot about the EU, we've been talking a lot about Finland, but non-state actors, meaning businesses, also local governments, universities, other institutions can play an important role. Now, we heard the Norwegian business perspective. I wonder, Jorma Ollila, if you could talk a bit about the role of Finnish businesses, because you know that intimately, and you know many of the things that are happening here and also at the Nordic level. What could the Finnish businesses contribute in this regard?
No, I think Finnish businesses at a reasonably good Nordic level, but a lot more needs to be done. So I think there was a recent survey indicating that only in 7% of the Finnish companies the strategy included thoughts or guidance for the future from the climate targets, and how the business should be redirected in order to make sure one is ready and actually utilizing some opportunities which there will be forthcoming with the climate change action. So it's early days, but Finnish companies are certainly not behind the Nordic level. Nordic level, it's okay, but significantly more needs to be done. So if you look at, I'll just take a couple of examples. If you take the power companies, the electricity companies, the way in which they've been proactive in developing the Nordic Nord Pool system, Nordic electricity market, has actually meant that the energy efficiency as to electricity generation has really been in optimal level. So so even if we had 20 years ago a very split local electricity company-based system, there's been a lot of good work and evolution done so that they are well up to speed, also able to use the renewable energies. Of course, there's a political decision making in most of these power companies, but still a lot has been done. If you then look at the SSAB with its big Finnish contingent or part of the business, the way they have done R&D in creating very low CO2 content products for the future. Not with us yet, but the concepts are there, and that's miles ahead of any steel companies. So then you look at the circular economy. The best example is that if any of you have visited the Outokumpu Tornio plant, during the last 10-15 years, there's been a lot of investment which goes through the whole of the value chain, which has led into 85% of the raw material used in Outokumpu plant being scrap, i.e. circulated. 85%. Where do you have another example where 85% of a raw material in one major company, one of the best in the world as such, but also one of the big ones. So that was sort of started 15 years ago and has been implemented the last 10 years. And it's exemplary in many ways, even if you might say that, well, the company happens to be the biggest electricity buyer today, fine, using scrap and creating a product which is the most durable and long term. So there's been a lot of forward-looking work in different kind of businesses. Does it go to the consumer type of businesses and services? Probably we are only seeing a start, and much more should be done. And but as such, the business is ready. The one thing that's missing is the price signals. You really don't win in many product areas, in most product areas, in most businesses, if you simply start looking at the CO2 targets 2050 and then start designing your business to that. You really have to figure out how you set your steps without a carbon price, and that's why I will not stop talking about it.
No, it is an important message, predictability for business, absolutely.
Exactly.
We have two comments from Minister Berner and Outi, and then we'll be moving forward to some of our final questions.
I would like to make actually 3 points. One, I think for the business community, it will be about efficiency, about profit making, but it's also about showing what kind of carbon or ecological or environmental footprints you are leaving. And when you look at startup companies in even a very small way, so many of those are already doing their business based on different logics than what we are used to. And that is, again, partly a result of utilizing data completely differently than what maybe legacy businesses are used to. And also, again, part of a different communication towards the consumer and the clients. Second, I think from my own perspective, we see that the role of municipalities and cities is growing enormously. And always, I believe, and the US is a good example of that, but I think also in Finland, we will see more and higher ambition level in CO2 reduction and controlling emissions on a level of a city. And there are also maybe more tools in a certain way to do that, but also the cities have to be more ambitious than the government as a total. Without the cities' actions, we will not achieve on a government level our decisions. Here we have some good examples with the city of Lahti, but also with others. The city of Helsinki has also done a great job. Thirdly, I think the role of NGOs is in this context extremely important. Firstly, also because NGO role is to look at flaws in many ways where the system is not functioning and where there are actions that are missing from a government or from a authority type of level. NGOs can act and work in a way that then can provoke new types of thinkings, but also new regulation in a certain way, which can then help and especially also help to rethink. And this is something which also needs to have space in a society to create that kind of work.
And Outi.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I mean, just on the business perspective and the business community. I mean, if you look at the main drivers today, you have the globalization, digitalization, and the third one is climate change. And yes, unfortunately, we don't have the global carbon price sort of steering investment decisions. But increasingly, businesses are adopting science-based targets. They are sort of also implementing internal carbon price in their sort of decisions that they make within the enterprises. So there's a lot of good sort of development happening already. I mean, decarbonizing the energy sector is actually easy. We already know how to do it. It's actually it's the other sectors that are the challenge, and they're like such as cement, and where you actually have to look at the other alternatives in terms of whether you can make things out of wood instead of cement and so on. Just on again on the importance of business. I mean, because in the end of the day, the scale of the challenge is so big. We are talking about shifting trillions. We are not talking about just sort of adding a couple of millions on for low carbon here and there. And one of the key objectives of the Paris Agreement is not just a temperature goal, but there's also this really famous Article 2.1c, which says that you have to realign your finance flows with towards low carbon. And that's not just for the developing countries, that's for all of us. And that's for the business, and that should be one of the guiding principles as we go forward. Just one very quick comment on this just transition. Yes, the transition. I mean, there's nothing more permanent than change. I mean, we're always sort of living in transition. And if we're looking at the professions, the class of professions that are growing most rapidly, I believe, in the US, I think it's the solar panel installer and the wind turbine engineer that are sort of growing very, very rapidly as sort of classes of profession, rather than if you're looking at what the fossil fuel industry is employing, for example. So there are a lot of sort of really positive signals out there, but they just need to be strengthened.
I think Oras and I would have quite a few follow-ups, but time is moving swiftly, and there's something that we want to include the audience in as well. We have one final question left, and this is very important because it's not only for our great panelists, but to all of you following this discussion here and online. The question is, what is the one commitment you can make today to take more climate action? It can be in your daily life, your work. For those of you running companies or making policy, we would hope that it would be something of a more regulatory sort. To show greater ambition, to take more action, to enable the acceleration of our efforts together. We would ask you to share your commitments on Twitter using the hashtag Climate Summit.
So the question is, what is the one commitment you can make today to take us further in climate action? I should probably underline that if you have 3 or 5, that's perfectly okay as well. So feel free to fit them in the now longer space of tweets available. Perhaps we can start with Mia-Petra Kumpulanatri. What would be your commitment?
As a person and mother of the family, I take the food waste more seriously. Actually, I woke up, my father is a cooking teacher, so I should know everything already. But then my notice was that I was promising to reduce the use of plastics. But then on the radio, there was a very good article that said that even if your ham package, you leave there one slice of ham, that's more serious for the climate than that rubbish around it. And that really woke me up that I will take care of both. But then traveling in many Vaasa, Helsinki, Strasbourg, Brussels, I really need a fridge not to have the waste food. That is really something that I think Finland should do the legislation, because there was majority in the parliament already to really make the food waste to be reduced. And in EU, I tried to do the same, but it ended up in this legislation that just the targets that every country should get it slowly, but not a very concrete action. And I promise in my work to include the youth, because I hope that the youth, they have a different kind of understanding of the climate change. They didn't learn it now, but they were born in the world, and every time I visit the school, every time I talk to young people, it's in their mind, and they are dedicated. So I have a good future hopes that they will continue the work.
Thank you very much, Mia-Petra. So it was food waste and youth, and I certainly agree with both. And with youth, the fantastic thing is that they also influence their parents and older generations.
Teach them, yes.
And teach their parents. Next, if we could have your commitment, Outi.
I'll be planting trees, and I'll tell you why. We have a cabin on an island, and this is just on a very sort of personal perspective, and there's a moose, and I think last winter there must have been a big one and a couple of small ones, because when we looked at all the pines, all the tips had been eaten or had been sort of folded backwards. So that's what I'll be doing this summer.
Planting trees.
Planting trees.
Excellent. Perhaps you may need to also water them if it continues to be as hot and dry as it has been recently. How about you, Jorma Ollila?
Yeah, I mean, on the trees, my commitment was to plant 100 trees for Finland, 100 years, and that still has 20 to go. So I'll be busy. But on the closer to the topic here, you might have seen that I've involved with the Climate Leadership Council, which has today come out with a statement with our Nordic colleagues, Markus Wallenbergs from Sweden and so on, and where we say that the European Union should set a target for achieving non-zero emissions at the latest by 2050. Based on the target, EU should agree on a binding carbon budget for the remaining greenhouse gases emissions, and that the revision and alignment of the 2030 and 2040 targets with the non-zero. So these three ideas really mean that I need to be committed in making sure that EU hopefully will do this, because there's a process underway, and that from the business side we will give ideas on how then all of that can be made to be real life.
Ambitious commitments. Thank you very much. And finally, Minister Berner.
Well, from a professional point of view, basically I have 3 things that I would like to achieve. One is to make sure that transport can be and has a real roadmap for a zero vision on its emissions, which is a very ambitious target. The question is, how can we do it and by when? Secondly, we would like to see that we can raise the amount of cycling and walking in Finland by 30% by the year 2030. And thirdly, I really hope that as a minister responsible for Nordic cooperation, we can do better in the Nordics.
Thank you very much for these great commitments, and I can hardly wait to see all the commitments you have been making online. Please continue doing so, you still have time for that. I've been trying to make notes with my shaky handwriting. Let's see if I can understand any of them at this point, because there were many really important ideas that were floated in this panel, and I feel I learned a lot. I think the first I got was we need to share what we do to inspire others. And I've been saying this before, sometimes we Finns are not so good at this. We do great things and then we forget to tell others about it, and then you get the impression that not so much is happening. Whereas in fact, as we heard in this panel, there is actually quite a bit happening also in Finland. Just transition and including people in the dialogue about the future of climate action is very important also for the sustainability of those policies and measures. We need partnerships between businesses, cities, governments, NGOs, and I think this summit today is all about partnerships, bringing these different partners to the same table to discuss how we can work more together. Nordic cooperation was mentioned several times, not only during the panel, but also in the previous presentations, and there is definitely a lot of potential there. Carbon pricing, you can't have a discussion on climate without talking about carbon pricing. We keep coming back to that for the simple reason that it is so central and important, and we need to keep talking about it to make it happen. Digitalization was identified as one of the greatest opportunities to make this transition happen in various sectors. I guess the basic message coming from this panel and the discussions today is that we need to move forward. We need to be doing more in our different roles and capacities. And I would like to end by saying that Finland truly has a unique opportunity coming both with the current presidency of the Arctic Council as well as the EU presidency next year. So we should definitely try to make use of that opportunity. So this brings us to the end of the Finnish Climate Summit plenary. What do we do now, Veera?
Well, firstly, I think our panel deserves a great round of applause. And if you just bear with me, we will be giving some instructions for lunch, which we'll be breaking for next climate. Obviously, climate-friendly food will be served right next to the plenary hall. It will be easy to find. And this gives you an amazing opportunity to reflect and discuss what you've heard today. And then Oras, I think, will be continuing into the parallel sessions.
Indeed, after you have enjoyed the climate-friendly lunch, we have 3 parallel sessions touching upon businesses, local government and investors, all of which have been discussed already during this panel and before. So please join those and continue the discussion specifically from these different sectors.
And when you registered for this event, you were asked to indicate which session you would like to attend. But no need to worry if you haven't done that. We'll make space for everyone at the parallel sessions. And you'll find the rooms on this corridor. So, and there's also Citra staff that will help you find the right session.
I hope you have noticed that the sessions on business and local government will take place in Finnish, and the one on investors will be carried out in English. Please also note that due to time constraints, we have to be very punctual, so we'll have to start the sessions on time. So you may want to go to the rooms a bit early to make sure that you don't miss anything important. And as before, please continue using the Climate Summit hashtag when you communicate about the discussions online. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for the day so far.
Thank you.